When I rushed to the hospital holding my feverish daughter, I unexpectedly ran into my ex-boyfriend in the ER. He glanced at the medical chart. We broke up 3 years ago, and your daughter is 3. He gave me a meaningful look. Amor Acebo, did you give birth just a month into your pregnancy? It was early morning, and my 3-year-old daughter's fever hadn't subsided. It was so high that it triggered febrile convulsions. I hurried to the hospital with her in my arms, and encountered Turi Riso in the emergency room. My ex-boyfriend from 3 years ago. Familiar features. An unexpected reunion. After a brief moment of shock, I quickly walked past him, still holding my daughter. Doctor, my daughter had ibuprofen half an hour ago, but her temperature has risen to 41.2 degrees Celsius, and she had a febrile seizure just before we arrived. I carefully explained the situation, afraid of missing any details. Turi Riso listened silently and then handed me a blood test order, asking me to take my daughter to get tested. She was so weak from the fever that even her usual fear of needles only made her bury her face in my chest and whimper softly. Once the blood results came back, Turi prescribed medication and set up an IV drip in the emergency department. I managed everything by myself, paying the bills, getting the medication, and setting up the IV drip. By the time it was all done, a cold sweat had soaked through my back. My daughter, exhausted from the fever, nestled against my chest and fell asleep. Whose child? Just as I was dozing off, a familiar voice interrupted my thoughts. Sleep fled instantly. I sighed inwardly, realizing that even hearing his voice again made my body tense up. After a few seconds, I looked up at him. Turi Riso had changed into his usual plain shirt, with a dark coat draped over it. A mask covered half his face. I stared at him for another few seconds, before registering what he had just asked. Whose child? I smiled, trying to appear calm. She's mine. As I spoke, I looked up at him. Don't you think she looks like me? Turi sat down beside me. Amor Acebo, we broke up 3 years ago. You have a 3-year-old daughter. So, you gave birth less than a month into your pregnancy. His words left me speechless, and I didn't intend to keep hiding it anymore. I glanced down at my daughter, who was now peacefully asleep, a layer of sweat forming on her forehead. Her fever had already subsided. As I gently brushed her damp hair, I whispered, Urandiria Sepadis daughter, Urandiria Sepeda. Yes, Turi frowned. But in the examination room, she called you mom. My movements froze. Some things, no matter how much time passes, still bring a lump to your throat when spoken aloud. Urandiria Sepeda is dead. I sniffed, holding back tears. No, I am her mom. Turi was silent for a long time. Maybe it was the deep night, or maybe the lingering feelings from meeting an old lover again. Once the door to my heart opened, I couldn't stop talking. I told Turi about my daughter's origins. Urandiria Sepeda grew up next door to me. She had no parents and was raised by her grandmother. But when she was a teenager, her grandmother died in a car accident. My mother, feeling sorry for her, took her in, and she lived with us, as one of the family. We were always the best of friends. But, a few years ago, she met a man 8 years older than her. He was wealthy, experienced, and way out of her league. While he was just playing around, she fell hard. When she got pregnant, he kept delaying marriage, and by the time she was about to give birth, he had disappeared completely. Urandiria gave birth alone, but just a month after the baby was born, she committed suicide due to postpartum depression. She left her child in my care, along with the house her grandmother left her. I couldn't abandon her, so, as an unmarried woman, I became a mother. It was a simple story, but speaking about Urandiria again brought back the tears I had been holding back. Turi remained silent for a long time, then gently patted my shoulder. He was still the same, awkward and not knowing how to comfort people. Suddenly, the little body in my arms stirred, and my daughter, Usoa Abrego, opened her eyes. Mom, she called out softly, then turned her gaze toward Turi. After staring for a few seconds, Usoa suddenly smiled. Are you my dad? Turi and I exchanged glances. He reached out and gently ruffled Uso's hair. No, I'm your uncle. Oh, her gaze dropped, disappointment evident on her pale face. Turi, perhaps feeling sorry for her, pulled 2 candies from his pocket to cheer her up. Usoa giggled, amused, but I just stood there, staring at the candies in his hand. They were white rabbit candies. I have low blood sugar, and back when we were dating, Turi always carried a couple of those candies in his pocket, just in case. It turns out, some habits never change. Now that her fever had subsided, Usoa was feeling better. Listening to a story on my phone, Turi and I sat on the nearby chairs, lost for words. After a long while, Turi quietly asked, "Do you have a boyfriend now?" His question made my heart race. I was about to shake my head and answer, but then I froze as I noticed someone across the room. Was it him? I asked Turi to watch my daughter, and hurried toward the hall. A middle-aged man in a tailored suit was carefully supporting a pregnant woman. The man wasn't wearing a mask. When I got closer, I studied him carefully. It was him, Beltran Mullen. 2 seconds later, the sound of a sharp slap echoed through the hall. I was the one who slapped him. I did it for Urandiria, for that foolish woman. This well-dressed scumbag was the one who had abandoned Urandiria and her daughter. At first, he cursed angrily, then frowned and scrutinized me. "You were Urandiria's friend?" he asked cautiously, unsure of himself. I couldn't be bothered to reply. The pregnant woman beside him had a fiery temper and wanted to confront me, but Beltran held her back. I shot him a glare and stormed off. When I returned to Usoa, my hands were still trembling. Honestly, slapping him was just a moment of impulse. Urandiria was gone. What could I do to him now? Turi glanced at me, but didn't say anything. He handed me a bottle of water, which he had opened for me. "Thank you." I took a sip and forced myself to calm down. Just as I screwed the cap back on, someone appeared in front of me. I looked up. It was Beltran Mullen. The pregnant woman was nowhere in sight. He stood before me, frowning, his gaze fixed on Usoa. My heart sank. Usoa looked just like him. He stared at her for a long moment, then quietly asked, "Is she Urandiria's daughter?" I tightened my grip on the water bottle. Get lost. I already regretted my impulsive slap. 3 years had passed, and in all that time, he hadn't taken any responsibility as a father. He had abandoned Urandiria and her daughter for 3 years. So why did I have to let him discover Usoa now? But it seemed Beltran didn't need me to answer. He knelt down and carefully examined Usoa. Noticing his attention, Usoa looked up at him. She had beautiful eyes, and she tilted her head, looking at him. "Are you?" Before I could respond, Beltran spoke first. He ruffled her hair and said gently, "I'm your dad." "Dad?" My daughter's eyes lit up. "You're really my dad?" She grabbed his hand with her free one, and placed it over mine. His hand was warm against mine, but it made me feel sick. My daughter, in her soft little voice, was unusually excited. "Dad, you finally showed up. Mom misses you so much. She calls your name in her dreams. Turi Riso, right? My sweet little girl." I reached out to cover her mouth, but it was too late. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Turi raise an eyebrow, and then, if I wasn't mistaken, Beltran's hand brushed mine slightly. I snapped back to reality, disgusted, and flung his hand away. "Get lost." Beltran looked at me. He didn't get angry or linger any longer. He just handed me a business card with his contact information and left. I clutched the card, feeling a whirlwind of emotions. After 2 bottles of IV fluid, Turi offered to take us home. By the time we got back, it was the middle of the night. After putting Usoa to bed, I sat alone in the living room, clutching a picture of Urandiria and crying. I cried for her because I couldn't understand why she had held on to such a sleazy man until her death. It seemed like Beltran was planning to acknowledge Usoa, but should I agree? I didn't know. He had abandoned Urandiria and her daughter, and was the cause of her suicide. As her friend, I could never forgive him. But he was still Usoa's biological father. For 3 years, I had tried to give Usoa a home, but I could never replace the fatherly love she was missing. As I stared at the photo, I suddenly remembered the letter Urandiria left behind before she died. Earlier, Beltran Mullen was mentioned. She said, if one day, Beltran Mullen wants to claim Usoa Abrego as his daughter, then let him. After all, she said, he is Usoa Abrego's biological father. She also said, if he never acknowledges her, then Usoa Abrego can only rely on you. Amor Acebo, I owe you. In the next life, I'll repay you. even if I have to work like a beast of burden. Liar. We promised to be sisters for life. Yet she didn't even fulfill that in this life. Instead, she postponed the promise to the next life. I read her final words again, then carefully put them away. Fine, I'll follow your wishes. The next morning, I dialed the number on the business card. Beltran Malin answered quickly. Over the phone, I told him about how Urandiria Cepeda had jumped to her death 3 years ago. Of course, I also told him that Usoa Abrego was his daughter. Beltran Malin sounded choked up. He sighed. I'm the one who wronged them. I didn't respond, because the moment I opened my mouth, I knew I wouldn't be able to resist cursing him and his ancestors. Then, cautiously, he asked if he could take Usoa Abrego home after she got better, to spend a day with her. He said he wanted to start making up for lost time with her. I hesitated, recalling Urandiria Cepeda's final letter, and then I agreed. A week later, Usoa Abrego had fully recovered, and as promised, Beltran Malin called me right on time. I gave him the address, and he drove over to pick her up. Before she got in the car, I nervously kept reminding her that I'd come pick her up the next day. Usoa Abrego nodded obediently. It was obvious that she was excited to be taken home by her father for the first time. However, that same evening, just after 10, I received a call from Beltran Malin. His voice was anxious as he told me that while Usoa Abrego had been playing upstairs, she had fallen down the stairs. My heart immediately clenched. I asked for the address and rushed over in a cab. The 20-minute drive felt suffocatingly long. Finally, the taxi stopped in front of the villa. I threw a $100 bill to the driver and hurried out. Following the address, I found the gate wide open. I ran to the yard and knocked on the door. The door opened quickly. Where's Usoa Abrego? I pushed past Beltran Malin and rushed inside, while behind me, he mumbled in a guilty voice, she's lying upstairs. The doctor already checked on her, she's fine but needs some rest. He told me that Usoa Abrego was in the first room on the right upstairs. I rushed up and pushed open the door, but there was no sign of her inside. The room was dimly lit by a small nightlight. Suddenly, I felt my wrists being grabbed. Beltran Malin had a tight grip, forcefully shoving me into the room. The next moment, he slammed the door shut, the lock clicking loudly in the quiet. He pinned me against the door, his hands landing on my waist with a firm squeeze before I could react. His breath reeked of alcohol as he spoke. Amor Acebo, I thought you were smart, but it turns out you're easy to deceive. This scumbag. Only then did I realize that the story about Usoa Abrego being injured was just a ruse. I struggled with all my strength, but the difference in our physical strength was too great. He restrained my arms with one hand while the other began tearing at my clothes. With my hands bound and panic rising, I slammed my head hard against his face. There was a dull groan from above, and after a brief wave of dizziness, I smelled the faint scent of blood in the air. Because of our height difference, I had hit him square in the mouth, probably causing his teeth to bleed. As he loosened his grip in pain, I quickly shoved him away. To my right, there was a decorative vase. When Beltran Malin lunged at me again, I grabbed the vase and smashed it hard against his head. There was a sharp crack as the vase shattered, followed by his low growl of pain. Not daring to stay a second longer, I bolted out of the room. Somehow, I faintly heard Turi Risso's voice near my ear. I glanced down to find that my phone was still in my hand. During the struggle, I must have accidentally dialed my emergency contact. Though we'd been apart for 3 years, my emergency contact had always remained Turi Risso. As I ran toward the stairs, I quickly said, East Lake Villa, House 18, come quickly. Before I could finish, I heard footsteps behind me. Then, my phone was snatched from my hand and smashed to the ground, the screen shattering and going black. Beltran Malin's voice came from above me, trying to run. The next second, I felt my hair being yanked back, his other hand gripping my shoulder as he dragged me back up the stairs. Beltran Malin threw me onto the bed. No matter how much I screamed and struggled, I couldn't break free from his hold. His head was bleeding, and his mouth was still bleeding from when I had hit him. His blood-stained teeth and those dark, sinister eyes made him look even more terrifying in the dim room. Run! He sneered at me, slapping me hard across the face. His body pressed heavily against mine, the stench of alcohol making me want to vomit. I had my eye on you back then, but that woman got pregnant, and she was so clingy, I didn't have the energy to come after you. He held my arms tightly, laughing coldly. It's been 3 years. He freed one hand and slowly stroked my face. I've always remembered this face. Hearing this, I felt nauseous. Spit. I spat hard at his face, disgusting. This action seemed to provoke him. Wiping the spit off his face, his expression turned icy. Suddenly, I felt a chill on my chest. He had torn my clothes. I screamed and tried to cover myself, but my hands were pinned down. I fought desperately, but it was no use, until I saw a small figure standing in the doorway. Usoa Abrego. She stood there barefoot, staring at us blankly. It wasn't until our eyes met that she burst into tears and ran toward the bed. Mommy, let go of mommy. Don't hurt mommy. She clung to Beltran Malin's clothes with her chubby little hands, trying to pull him away. Get out of here, he barked angrily, kicking her away. How could a 3-year-old girl withstand the strength of an adult man? She was sent flying several meters, hitting the ground and wailing in pain. My heart ached. 3 years. Even though Usoa Abrego wasn't my biological child, I had raised her for 3 years, and from the moment she started talking, she had called me, Mommy, in her sweet little voice. Now, my little princess, the one I had held in the palm of my hand, had been kicked across the room by her own father. I bit down hard on Beltran Malin's shoulder, hearing his pain groan above me. As his grip loosened, I quickly pushed him off, and stumbled toward Usoa Abrego. I scooped her up, realizing my hands were trembling violently. The little girl was terrified, sobbing uncontrollably in my arms. I knew there was no way I could escape while holding the child, so I took a deep breath and turned to face him. Beltran Malin, Usoa Abrego is your daughter. How could he bear to do this? He rubbed his shoulder, where I had bitten him, and sneered, who knows whose kid she is? She only ever had one boyfriend, you. Holding Usoa Abrego, I glared at him coldly. If you don't believe me, do a DNA test. You don't have to acknowledge her, I'll raise her. But you can't insult Urandiria Cepeda. Half of what I said was out of anger, defending Urandiria Cepeda. The other half was to buy time for Tori Riso to arrive. With Usoa Abrego in my arms, I couldn't escape on my own. Beltran Malin laughed. Standing by the bed, he seemed to know that I wouldn't be able to flee with the child. He even lit a cigarette. So what if she's my daughter, he said, you saw it at the hospital that day. My wife's pregnant. It's a boy. I don't need more kids. You think a daughter born to a random woman can enter the Malin family? My body trembled slightly with anger. Urandiria Cepeda, you fool. This is the man you gave your life for, the one you bore a child for. I took a deep breath, wanting to say something to buy more time, but before I could, Beltran Malin suddenly put out his cigarette and lunged at me, yanking Usoa Abrego from my arms, and dragging me back to the bed. He was drunk and unbelievably strong. From the doorway, I heard Usoa Abrego's terrified cries. My clothes, this time, everything was exposed. I was trembling, desperately struggling. Suddenly, someone seemed to appear at the door. I tilted my head and, through Beltran Malin's arm, I caught sight of the person. It was Tori Riso. He rushed over and forcefully pulled Beltran Malin off of me. The Beltran Malin I couldn't shake off no matter how hard I tried, was now being pinned to the ground and beaten by Tori Riso. He didn't have a chance to fight back. I stood there, stunned by what I was seeing, unable to react. If the police hadn't arrived, Beltran Malin might have been beaten to death on the spot by Tori Riso. Before coming, Tori Riso had called the police. We were all taken away by the officers and gave our statements. Afterward, Tori Riso took me and Usoa Abrego home. The little one cried herself to sleep, snuggled deep in my arms. Tori Riso stayed the night at my place, sleeping in the living room. In the middle of the night, I got up to use the bathroom, trying to walk as quietly as possible, but he still sat up immediately. I knew he was worried about me. I tried my best to act calm, not wanting to trouble him. But the moment I thought about what happened tonight, about Beltran Malin's sinister eyes, I couldn't stop trembling. Just thinking about it made me feel nauseous. That night, I dry heaved over the toilet several times. Each time, Tori Riso would stand behind me, gently patting my back. All I could think about was how Beltran Malin should receive the punishment he deserved. But, a week later, when I went to pick up Usoa Abrego from kindergarten, I saw him at the entrance. A Maybach was parked on the side of the road, and Beltran Mullen leaned against the car door, a cigarette between his fingers, smiling at me. He was dressed in a suit, one that was clearly expensive. He stood there casually, smiling at me. The sun was shining brightly, but when our eyes met, his still filled with shadows, I couldn't help but shiver. He was perfectly fine. There wasn't enough evidence to prove his intent, and in terms of injuries, he was actually hurt worse. And with his background, after that nightmare of a night, he still walked away unscathed. And now, he even walked over to me, mingling with the parents waiting to pick up their children, cigarette in hand, smiling and whispering to me, "Amor Acebo. There's plenty of time, let's take it slow." After that, he glanced at the kindergarten door, and said meaningfully, "Usoa Abrego should be getting out soon, right?" I didn't know what he meant. But after saying that, he smiled at me, and then got into his car. I couldn't even figure out what he was trying to achieve by coming to see me. Just as I was lost in thought, someone gently patted my shoulder. I snapped out of it, instinctively dodging. I turned and saw it was Turi Riso. He's been busy with work, but lately, to ease his worries, he's been coming by every day to take me and Usoa Abrego home safely. I thought to myself, he really deserves the title of best ex-boyfriend. "What's wrong?" Turi Riso asked softly. He clearly hadn't seen Beltran Mullen earlier. "Nothing," I shook my head, and just at that moment, the kindergarten bell rang. When I went to pick up Usoa Abrego, I was surprised to see that their class had a new teacher, and it was someone familiar, Chevelle Floria, Turi Riso's childhood friend. Everyone knew she liked him. Back when Turi Riso and I were dating, she was constantly pulling little stunts behind my back. "Turi Riso." She frowned. "What are you doing here?" Though her question was directed at Turi Riso, her eyes were fixed on me. I sighed inwardly, feeling like my troubles just kept piling up recently. Now Usoa Abrego's new teacher was her. Before Turi Riso could respond, I spoke quietly, "I'm here to pick up my daughter," and happened to run into Turi Riso, so we chatted a bit. Chevelle Floria stared at me. "What's your daughter's name?" "Usoa Abrego." She nodded, called for Usoa with a smile, and brought her over to me. "Amor Acebo." She looked at me, then glanced at Usoa Abrego, her words loaded with hidden meaning. "You and Turi Riso broke up 3 years ago, and now your daughter is already 3. I didn't want to engage, so I just nodded in acknowledgement. As I was about to leave with Usoa, I heard her voice again, this time, loud enough for Turi Riso to hear, "That old guy in the Maybach earlier, he's the father of the child, right? Amor Acebo, so you cheated on Turi Riso 3 years ago, didn't you?" I held Uso's hand, turned around, and looked at her. Most of the kids had already been picked up by their parents, and we were standing near the entrance. Chevelle Floria gave me a scornful look, and said, "What's wrong, did I hit the mark?" She raised her hand, trying to grab Turi Riso's sleeve. "Turi Riso, don't let yourself be fooled again like before, running in circles while being treated like a backup." But her hand came up empty. Turi Riso had already walked over to me, frowning. "He was here." I nodded. Turi Riso's brows furrowed as he took Uso's other hand. "I'll take you home." Usoa, holding both our hands, hopped cheerfully toward the car. Only when we reached the car did I realize, we had all completely ignored Chevelle Floria, without anyone bothering to respond to her. Looking back, that might have been the best retaliation, to let her throw her heavy punches, and watch them land on nothing but air, leaving her seething in frustration. Turi Riso drove us all the way home. But Usoa clung to his hand, refusing to let go. "Uncle, stay and have dinner with us." The little one sometimes mispronounced his name, calling him Enk, but Turi Riso didn't mind. At her request, he looked at me. I quickly nodded, "Yes, stay for dinner." "Okay." He came upstairs with us. Because I live alone with my daughter, I always keep my fridge stocked full. Turi Riso played with her in the living room while I went to the kitchen to cook. I'm terrible at cooking, but at least I'm fast. In half an hour, 3 dishes and a soup were ready. Braised ribs, stir-fried asparagus lettuce, steamed sausage, and a loofah soup. All dishes Turi Riso liked. I couldn't cook them back then, but now I can. I know my cooking isn't great, but Riso seemed to appreciate it. After the meal, Isoa was so full she almost fell asleep at the table. I took her to the bedroom, and after a little coaxing, she drifted off into a deep sleep. After tucking her in, I quietly left the room, only to find that the dishes had already been cleaned, and there were several bottles of alcohol and some snacks on the table. Riso sat at the table and looked up at me. Drink a little. Okay. I never thought that 3 years after our breakup, I would sit down with Riso, calmly drinking, and reminiscing about the past. Knowing his personality, I had always thought we would never cross paths again in this lifetime. He poured me a drink, but downed his own in one gulp. I looked at the familiar face across from me, and memories I had long buried began to resurface. With emotions running high, I drank faster than usual. Before we had even exchanged a word, the bottle was already half empty. Alcohol is the best catalyst for emotions. Things you never dared to say out loud suddenly feel easier to express with its help. After a long silence, Riso looked at me. When you broke up with me, I was sick. He took another sip, his tone casual. You said your stomach hurt? It wasn't my stomach. He put down his glass, staring quietly at me. It was a tumor. At the time, I didn't know if it was malignant or benign. Judging by my own symptoms, I thought it was malignant. I listened, stunned, not knowing what to say. And it was benign. He smiled, but by the time I got the results, we had already broken up. I lowered my gaze, unable to speak. When I broke up with Riso, it was right after Urandiria Sekpeda had passed away. I was overwhelmed, dealing with her funeral arrangements, while also caring for a newborn baby. I remember that Riso had messaged me, saying he wasn't feeling well, but he sent that message in the morning. It wasn't until late at night that I remembered to check my phone. I called him, and he picked up almost immediately. He gently asked me what I was busy with, but I glanced at the sleeping baby beside me, and didn't tell him the truth. I wasn't sure if I should tell him everything. After being together for so long, I knew him too well. If I told him the truth, he would accept this child and take on the responsibility. But he was already carrying so much on his shoulders, and I didn't want to burden him further. At that time, Riso had just started his job after graduation, and in recent years, his father had died of a terminal illness, leaving behind hundreds of thousands in debt to pay it off. He worked during the day at the hospital, and took on extra part-time jobs at night. He was so frugal, eating nothing but steamed buns and pickles, stretching every penny as far as it would go. And I had just graduated too, with no family to lean on, and a newborn to take care of. I had no idea how I was going to support myself. After hesitating, I decided to keep the truth from him, and ended the relationship over the phone. I knew that with his pride, once I said those words, he wouldn't try to stop me. He was always too proud, the kind of person who would suffer in silence. But even now, I still remember the moment I told him I wanted to break up. There was a long silence on the phone before he finally asked me one question. He asked, "Is it me who made your life so hard?" He didn't have much money to buy me expensive gifts, because of the debts he had to pay off. But he never missed a holiday without giving me something. Most of the time, it was small trinkets he made himself, not worth much, but the thought behind them was priceless. Riso wouldn't have known that with just a single sentence. I was fighting back tears on the other end of the phone. I suppressed my emotions and softly replied, "Yes." And with that, Riso didn't make things difficult for me anymore. He quietly apologized, and chose to set me free. For the next 3 years, we had no contact. As my thoughts drifted away, I suddenly realized that Riso had been watching me the whole time. Just as I understood him, he understood me as well. So, the reason you broke up with me back then was because of Usoa Abrego, right? Yes. He chuckled softly. You didn't want to be a burden to me. Yes. He didn't say anything more but got up, and started walking toward me. Even though we had once been incredibly close, my heart still raced as he approached. I turned my gaze away, unsure of what he was going to do or how I should react. He pulled out the chair next to me, and sat down. Actually, when we met again this time, I had already decided that if you were still single, I'd ask to get back together with you. Even if the reason you broke up back then was really just because I was poor. I stared at him, speechless. We were so close that I could see my reflection in his eyes. Why? Turi Riso picked up my cup, took a sip, and when he spoke again, his voice was a little hoarse. These past few years, I've worked really hard. I've already paid off my debts. I can now be with you without any reservations. I won't let you go through hard times with me again. He gently tested the waters by slowly taking my hand, his palm warm, a familiar warmth, a familiar face. I could hear my heartbeat growing louder, but when I thought of Usoa Abrego sleeping in the next room, I hesitated. But, Turi Riso interrupted me. You were never a burden, and neither is she. All right, we had already endured the hardest times separately. There was no reason to keep punishing ourselves now. After Turi Riso and I reconciled, he wanted to take me home to meet his family. After turning him down a few times, I finally gave in. On the weekend, I bought some gifts and fruit and got into Turi Riso's car with Usoa Abrego. We agreed to have dinner at his place. But what I didn't expect was to see Chevelle Floria in the living room when we arrived. She was sitting on the couch, chatting happily with Turi Riso's mother. Turi Riso held my hand and led Usoa Abrego and me into the living room. After greeting everyone, I tightened my grip on Usoa Abrego's hand and said, "Say hi to Grandma." "Don't." Turi Riso's mother cut in first. Turi Riso didn't even have a girlfriend before this, and now he suddenly has a granddaughter. I'm not sure I can accept that so quickly. Her stance was clear. Turi Riso frowned and said, "Mom, didn't you say you liked Amor Acebo, and wanted me to bring her home to meet you?" His mother smiled. "Yes, I do like Amor Acebo." But anyone could tell how insincere that statement was. The atmosphere was tense. And then Usoa Abrego suddenly spoke up. "Mommy, why should I call this young lady Grandma?" Everyone froze. Turi Riso's mother burst into laughter. "Oh my, what a sweet girl. Go wash your hands. It's time to eat." In the bathroom, while washing our hands, Usoa Abrego whispered to me, "Mom, does Grandma not like Usoa Abrego?" "No," Turi Riso answered for me. "Grandma loves Usoa Abrego." During dinner, the tension remained thick, especially after Turi Riso's mother made her favoritism toward Chevelle Floria blatantly obvious. And Chevelle Floria wasn't one to back down. After his mother served her more food, Chevelle Floria shifted the conversation to me. "Amor Acebo, I heard that Usoa Abrego is your illegitimate daughter. Is she the child of that man who drove a Maybach to see you?" "Auntie, you don't know this, but Amor Acebo is very popular because of how beautiful she is. You'd better make sure Turi Riso keeps a close eye on his girlfriend." Chevelle Floria's sharp and mocking tone was on full display as she looked at me, even raising her eyebrow when our eyes met. I put down my chopsticks and replied calmly, "It was just an old friend I ran into. But since you seem so fixated on the Maybach, maybe you should find yourself a rich man in the future." Then, I turned to Turi Riso and asked, "Do you know any preschools? I want to transfer Usoa Abrego. A teacher who gossips about illegitimate children in front of them probably isn't very good at their job." Turi Riso poured me a glass of juice and smoothly replied, "I do know a preschool director. I'll contact them tomorrow." Amor Acebo. Chevelle Floria's face turned pale from my retort, and she slammed the table. "You have the nerve to come back to Turi Riso's house after having a child with a rich older man." As the tension escalated, Usoa Abrego suddenly burst into tears. Her chubby little hands wiped her eyes as she sobbed. "Teacher, stop fighting. Mommy isn't my real mommy. My real mommy jumped off a building after giving birth to me." I was stunned. She was just over 3 years old, though she was more mature than kids her age due to her circumstances. How could she know all this? She continued between sobs, her words disjointed. "Mommy raised me. She's the best mommy ever. She really loves Uncle. She even cries in her sleep, calling his name. She's not what you all say she is." I stood there, watching her, tears streaming down my face. I suddenly remembered, about a month ago, one night after putting her to bed, I had drunk a little too much. I ended up sitting in the living room, crying while holding Orandiria Cepedes' photo. When I looked back, I saw that Usoa Abrego had woken up at some point, and was standing barefoot in the doorway, watching me. At the time, I thought she hadn't heard anything since she didn't react. But now I realized she must have heard everything. This child was always so heartbreakingly mature. Seeing her try to defend me, my heart ached. I picked her up and wiped her tears away. Be good, Usowa Abrego. I'm your mommy. After that, I carried her over to Turi Riso's mother and slightly bowed my head. Sorry, Auntie. I'm going to take Usowa Abrego and leave now. I glanced at Turi Riso before walking out the door with Usowa Abrego in my arms. He quickly followed. He didn't say anything, only gently ruffling Usowa Abrego's hair and letting out a sigh. After that, I never went back to Turi Riso's home again. Life gradually returned to normal. Even Beltran Malin didn't show up anymore, which was a relief. However, recently, something seemed off with Usowa Abrego. She seemed down, uninterested in anything I said. I was worried and asked her several times, but she always said she was fine. Until one night, while bathing her, I noticed a bruise on her inner thigh, in a place that would be hard to injure even for a playful child. Alarmed, I immediately asked her how it happened. Usowa Abrego kept shaking her head, saying she didn't know, but her expression said otherwise. I took a deep breath. Was it Chevelle Floria? At the mention of Chevelle Floria, Usowa Abrego couldn't hold it in anymore, and suddenly burst into tears. Her small body trembled in my arms, likely out of fear. I suppressed the anger brewing inside me, and gently comforted her. Trust mommy, okay? Mommy will take care of this. That night, I left Usowa Abrego with a neighbor for a little while, and went out by myself. When I returned, Usowa Abrego was already asleep. After thanking the neighbor, I carried her home and placed a necklace with a cartoon charm around her neck. The next morning, I dropped her off at preschool as usual and picked her up on time. Once home, I removed the necklace. Inside the charm was a tiny hidden camera I had arranged to be installed. Come here, I have something to ask. Why did you bully the little girl earlier? Half of Chevelle Floria's face appeared on the video. I didn't. Asterisk slap. The clear sound of a slap echoed, and the camera spun. It seemed my daughter had been knocked to the ground with one hit. The sound of Chevelle Floria's voice mixed with sobs echoed again. You dare to cry after bullying others. Say it. Are you wrong? My daughter kept crying, but she didn't speak. Chevelle Floria reached out and slapped her. However, aside from that one slap, she hit her in places where it wouldn't be visible. She pinched the inside of her thigh, kicked her in the butt, even pricked her with a needle while whispering insults about Usowa Abrego's mother. I couldn't bear to watch after halfway through the video. Chevelle Floria must have chosen the surveillance blind spots in the kindergarten, or she wouldn't be so brazen. I also heard from other teachers that the principal seemed to be her aunt, which explains why she acted so recklessly. But what she didn't expect was that I secretly recorded the video. By now, night had fallen, and I picked up my phone and called the police. That evening, Usowa Abrego and I were taken to the police station to file a report, and the police took pictures of the bruises on Usowa Abrego's body as evidence. Turi Riso rushed over when he got the news and stayed with us until late at night, driving us home. I'm sorry, he said quietly on the way. I didn't think she would go this far. He sighed, eyes full of guilt. This is all because of me. It's not your fault, I replied softly, stroking Usowa Abrego's hair as she slept in the car. Some people are just bad for no reason. Chevelle Floria was arrested, though I wasn't sure what would happen next. But I released the video, and it quickly spread online. Chevelle Floria became infamous. People were digging into her life and hurling insults. But honestly, I didn't care about the insults. What mattered to me was, now that the video was out there, even if she were released one day, no kindergarten in this city would ever hire her again. After the Chevelle Floria incident, my daughter recovered quickly. I moved her to a new kindergarten, and she fit in well, even making 2 good friends. However, I had to go on a business trip soon, and Turi Riso had a surgery scheduled in the evening. I wasn't sure what to do about Usowa Abrego. Just as I was hesitating about whether to bring her along on my trip, Turi Riso made the decision for me. He sent Usowa Abrego to his mom's house. At first, I was worried, but on the train, Turi Riso sent me a video. His mom was laughing, playing on the floor with Usowa Abrego, pretending to be a tiger. Knowing I was still concerned, he sent several more photos and videos. It seemed like Usowa Abrego was getting along great with his mom. Watching all those videos, I suddenly felt a bit emotional. Maybe my future mother-in-law was already won over by my daughter. A week later, When I returned from the trip, I bought lots of gifts and went to Turi Risso's house. As soon as I walked in, I saw Usoa Abrego snuggled up in his mom's arms, sweet-talking her. Pretty grandma, I think egg tarts are the best thing ever. Oh, I wish you could try one too. Clearly, she wanted to eat one herself. Her words made Turi Risso's mom beam with joy, and she immediately started getting dressed to go buy some. They hadn't noticed us yet, so Turi and I quickly stepped in to stop her. During this visit, Turi's mom seemed to have completely changed her attitude toward me. She was no longer distant but was instead overly enthusiastic, acting like she'd already accepted me as her daughter-in-law. I pulled Turi aside, asking, "What's going on?" He raised an eyebrow and replied, "Don't ask me, ask your precious daughter." When I turned around, I saw Usoa Abrego clinging to Turi's mom's hand, being affectionate. When she noticed me looking, the little one even winked at me, not forgetting to say something nice on my behalf while continuing to sweet-talk her grandma. "Pretty grandma, my mom says you're so young and beautiful, but she doesn't even know how great of a cook you are." Turi's mom laughed heartily and rolled up her sleeves. "Well, in that case, I'll show your mom a little something special tonight." She turned to me, saying, "Amor Acebo, why don't you and Turi keep my granddaughter company for a bit while I whip up something delicious for you?" Well, it had only been a week, and Turi's mom was already calling Usoa Abrego my granddaughter. Thanks to my daughter, I had been fully accepted into the family. Though Turi and I had reconciled and met the parents, we hadn't even discussed marriage yet. But Usoa Abrego had already started calling him Dad, following him around all day with that title. Turi's mom had lived alone since her husband passed away, and now that she was getting older, it was understandable that she sometimes felt lonely. Usoa Abrego, with her sweet words and loving nature, had completely won her over. If she didn't see the child for a couple of days, she'd come over to visit. Today was no different. It was Friday, and Turi's mom called me early in the morning, asking if I could bring Usoa Abrego over for the night. I smiled and agreed. However, when I went to pick up Usoa Abrego from kindergarten that evening, something unexpected happened. While riding my electric bike, a passing car grazed me, causing me to fall. It wasn't serious. I only scraped my leg a little, but it delayed me for a while. When I finally got to the kindergarten, I was told that Usoa Abrego had already been picked up. Picked up? I was stunned. Who picked her up? The teacher said the person had the pickup card from the kindergarten, and claimed to be her father. Father? My heart sank as I quickly asked for a description of the person's appearance. It matched. It had to be Beltran Mollin. What did he want this time? To use Usoa Abrego as leverage again. Standing outside the kindergarten, I didn't care about assigning blame at that moment. All I wanted was to find my daughter as soon as possible. Suddenly, my phone rang. I quickly pulled it out, and sure enough, it was Beltran Mollin. "Where is Usoa Abrego?" I demanded. He chuckled coldly. "Relax. I've taken my daughter. Don't worry, I'll take good care of her from now on, so you don't need to bother yourself." No, I rejected the idea immediately. "Didn't you say you had a son? I'm worried you won't treat Usoa Abrego well. Until she turns 18, I won't feel comfortable leaving her with you." To this day, I can still vividly remember the night when he kicked his own daughter across the room in his villa. Beltran Mollin scoffed. "Give her to you," he sneered. "Why would I let you keep my daughter?" But this time, he didn't mention anything about using Usoa Abrego to manipulate me. After a tense back and forth, he hung up. I stood there gripping my phone, my body trembling with rage. Suddenly, my phone rang again. It was Turi. I took a deep breath and answered. Turi's voice came through the line. "Be careful around Beltran Mollin. He might try to take Usoa Abrego." I froze. "How do you know?" Turi didn't know what had just happened at the kindergarten, so he explained in a low voice. "I just saw a local news report. Beltran Mollin's wife was in a car accident a few days ago and died on the spot. Her brother, who has a terrible temper, had heard from his sister that Beltran had been seeing someone else while she was pregnant. He suspected the accident was his brother-in-law's doing, so he went to Beltran's house and crippled him." Crippled? That brother-in-law was really something. No wonder Beltran Mollin suddenly took Usoa Abrego. His pregnant wife had died in a car accident, and now that he couldn't have more children, Usoa Abrego was his only bloodline left. Thinking this through, I realized there was no rush to confront him. For the moment, at least, I knew Usoa Abrego was safe. Plus, with our vastly different social standings, even if Turi and I went over, we wouldn't be able to take her away. And given that Beltran was her biological father, we'd have no chance of winning a legal battle. Either, I suspect that Beltran Mullen might really be involved in his wife's death. If this is true, once a murder case is exposed, no matter how powerful he is, he won't be able to escape justice anymore. I force myself to calm down, and then use my connections to hire 2 private detectives. I didn't have much confidence, but I had to try my best. Fortunately, I bet correctly. A few days later, the private investigators sent me a message saying they had obtained evidence that Beltran Mullen had tampered with the vehicle involved in the accident. Moreover, Beltran Mullen's wife had another man, and based on the timeline, the baby she was carrying might not have even been Beltran Mullen's. No wonder when Beltran Mullen talked about the son his wife was expecting, he looked so proud. How could he have caused an accident before she gave birth? Now I understand. In theory, if private detectives could find this evidence, so could the police. Looking back, it's clear that Beltran Mullen must have pulled some strings behind the scenes, and everything was just processed as a formality before the case was ruled an accident. At the time, not many people even saw the news before Beltran Mullen spent money to suppress it. It was purely by chance that Tori Riso came across it. I spent a lot of money to buy the evidence from the private investigators, and to avoid any accidents, Tori Riso handed it directly to a friend of his in the police department. Since a murder was involved, to avoid alerting Beltran Mullen, the police sent someone immediately to bring him in for questioning. After a full day and night of interrogation, Beltran Mullen confessed. He admitted to tampering with the car and faking the brake failure. After Beltran Mullen was arrested, I brought Usoa Abrego back home. I have to admit, after facing such a major blow in life and discovering that Usoa Abrego was his only blood relative, Beltran Mullen actually treated her quite well. When I went to pick her up, his 3-story villa was filled with pink, girly items everywhere. But so what? It's just crocodile tears. He knew all along that Usoa Abrego was his biological daughter, yet that kick he gave her back then didn't hold back at all. The night of Beltran Mullen's sentencing, after putting Usoa Abrego to bed, I pulled Tori Riso along to drink with me. I drank until I was completely drunk, holding Urandiria Cepedes' photo and crying non-stop. Do you see? Justice has been served on the evil. He's going to be sentenced. He never deserved to be Usoa Abrego's father. Urandiria Cepeda, you irresponsible fool. You did leave behind an amazing daughter though. Usoa Abrego is doing great. You can rest in peace now. I rambled on for quite a while, but no one answered me. Suddenly, a voice sounded behind me. Mom, it was Usoa Abrego again, awake and standing at the door, rubbing her eyes. She walked over and nestled into my arms. As she was about to drift back to sleep, I gently stroked her hair. Tori Riso remained silent by my side. Then, suddenly, I heard her soft voice from my arms. Mom, you're the best mom in the world too. It was Usoa Abrego's voice. I froze for a moment, then saw the little girl sit up. Though small in size, her emotional intelligence was remarkably high. She always knew how to keep everyone happy. After praising me, she took the photo from my hand, and looked at it. Is this Mom? She's so pretty. Then, she kissed the photo and said, she's the best mom in the world too. After carefully putting the photo down, she didn't forget to peek at Tori Riso and say, you're the best dad in the world too. The originally heavy and emotional atmosphere was instantly warmed up by this little sweetheart. I tucked Usoa Abrego back into bed and helped her fall asleep again. I curled up next to her and drifted off as well. I had a dream of Urandiria Cepeda. That silly woman held Usoa Abrego and cried for a long time. Then she grabbed my hand just like when we were young. She said, Amor Acebo, thank you. In the next life, let's be sisters again. Okay, next time, I'll take care of you and let you be as carefree as you want. In the dream, I angrily scolded her. You're spinning tales again, making promises. Just watch me beat you up. But when I woke up, I found my pillow wet with tears. Fine, for my daughter's sake, I'll reluctantly agree to be your sister again in the next life. That day, I brought flowers to Urandiria Cepedes' grave. At first, there was fog, but by the time we reached the cemetery, The morning mist had lifted. I walked to the tombstone and laid down her favorite sunflowers. The fog has lifted, and life moves forward. I will take good care of her, and I will take care of myself too. This story has ended. Thank you for subscribing to the channel, where you can get the latest updates. New stories are posted daily.